Hello everyone. What I'm doing this week, I'm going to give you two recordings, and to start off with, I thought I would actually give you some spoken feedback on the forum tasks to kind of generate an understanding, and rather than writing back to each of you, I thought I'll do it in this format, and I'll upload these slides where I've kind of collated your answers. I'm not going to be talking about all the forum tasks, but I will be speaking about the first task where you assessed, if you like, or interpreted the type of questions and classified them asked. And I'm also going to be speaking about the second task, your research questions, and kind of talk you through that. And the fifth task, which is where you gave a critical evaluation and reviewed a source. And most of you seem to have done the Gresham text, so I'll talk you and kind of chat in respect to your answers for that. So the first one, looking through the questions, in respect to the first question, what can learning theory gain from a cultural studies approach to children's use of computer games? Most of you seem to have put this down as an analytical question. As you remember, analytical questions extend description and can be described as a hypothesis, and they often look for a causal relationship, which that doesn't really. So I think the takeaway message really with this whole exercise is that so much of this is quite subjective, and the aim is not to pin the tail on the donkey and say, yes, I got the right one, or, the most common answer, but for you to reflect on the assumptions and the implications of the various research questions, with the aim of you having a clear understanding as you're articulating your own question. Personally, I would suggest that, or I would classify that question as a theory building question, because it is very theoretical. It's not really a hypothesis that you're investigating so much. You're actually seeking to contribute to theory. So that would be how I would interpret that question. The second one, pretty much everyone seemed to think is a predictive question. Will children spend less time? So you're predicting that they probably will if they're taught to design their own. Whether or not we agree with this statement or not, I would agree with you that it sits quite nicely as a predictive question in respect to seeking to predict an impact or influence, and generally we use quantitative methods so we can explore a statistical relationship in that regard. So I would agree with you in that one. Third question, what do parents do to promote responsible computer use, and how would responsible computer use be defined? Most of you have got that down as an evaluative question. I would agree with that. You could possibly even call it a descriptive question in respect to what they do, and you just describe it. I also like the third students kind of making this your own approach by having two answers and saying, okay, the first one might be a problem solving aspect and the second one an evaluative, and it's good. You need to kind of put yourself in that interpretation. So I like how you have interpreted that in a slightly different way. Next one, when do children choose to use the computer and for what purposes? Most of you have got that as a descriptive. Some of you have got it as an analytic. I put it down as a descriptive one as well in my thinking, because looking at an analytic question, we don't really have a hypothesis in there, because we're looking at what purposes, so that's a bit more open. You would assume that it would be for a particular purpose if we're looking at a hypothesis to test that variable. So it's just kind of a little heads up for you. Next question. How can teachers use information and communication technologies to improve their own learning? You've all pretty much decided that that's a problem-solving question, and I would agree with that. It's a real problem that we're trying to solve. It explores ways to improve and is often really closely linked to practitioner research, which that question would suggest. Moving on then to the questions that are buzzing away in your heads. And first of all, I know that this is a tricky thing, and it's perfectly normal to kind of go, oh, I'm not sure how I'm actually going to ask this. And you will find that you will keep on tweaking your question pretty much throughout the course of this subject, and that's fine. I'm expecting you to do that. As I said to the face-to-face students when I was doing my PhD thesis about 7 years in, I was doing it part-time, and 7 years in I thought, actually, rather than phrasing my question using the word effect, using the word shape would be much better. So I kind of changed the wording in my 7th year, and that's fine. So obviously you don't change the focus completely, but it is fine to be playing around, because it's by nature your thinking is going to evolve as you're exploring more and more about this subject and topic, so that's fine. First student is suggesting how can schools increase the importance of engagement in the arts within the school system to show that it improves student learning and knowledge, not just for themselves but as an approach to other learning areas. I think, and in your comments I've only just kind of pasted what you're toying with. You're saying that yes, that this is quite a broad question, and you're flagging that it's early days, and I would agree with that. It is a very broad question, and you're making quite a few assumptions in here, because first of all, if we look at engagement, it's one of those terms that we use a lot in education, but it's actually a really broad term, because we might look at behavioural engagement in students being on task. We might look at cognitive engagement in respect to how students use learning strategies. From your question there, I'm assuming that you're actually looking more at an emotional engagement aspect and the value we attribute to the arts. So you would need to define that a bit more. You also having a measurement component in that to show that it improves students' learning, that's actually you making an assumption. So if you were going to go for a hypothesis, you would need to be really theory driven and probably decide on an aspect of students' learning that you would seek to measure. So you might look at how students persist with learning tasks, for example, if they within the arts. Or you could look at learning gains in a particular subject and do kind of a pre-test and post-test. But then you've also got the follow-on with knowledge, not just for themselves, but as an approach to other learning areas. So you're kind of looking at the transfer of some aspect from the engagement within the arts to that. So I think I agree with you that it is quite a broad, and I think you need to clarify your focus, because otherwise it's going to be very, very difficult for you to investigate it. And ironically, and in fact, in this week's seminar, I'm going to be talking about how we try to narrow down questions, and I'm going to give you some examples as well. So this is just some feedback beforehand. Ironically, the more narrow a question is, the more meaningful our investigation will be, and we will actually make a lot more sense. So even though we're often quite ambitious and want to, because we think, oh, but this relates to that and that relates to that, so we try to be quite all-encompassing, we're actually not doing ourselves a favour in respect to that, because we're blurring the lines too much. It's much better to keep it really within a particular parameter and try to gain an understanding from that, and then we can move on to something else later on. But I would suggest to narrow it down. Decide on whether you want to look at a whole school thing, or whether you want to look at, so for example, strategies that schools might use to promote engagement within the art, and look at the kind of values that they underpin, or look at one aspect of students' learning, how that relates to the art, and see if there's a particular strategy that you might look at and consider doing some sort of measurement in that respect. Keeping in mind, though, with minimal risk and so on, most of your data will be gained from teachers and from using observations and possibly interviewing teachers. You can observe students, but you're not going to be able to interview students. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. Okay, second student is looking at mobile phones and exploring a number of different questions kind of posed. First of all, how would a teacher know that a mobile phone may assist? Again, that's an assumption. A student effectively in the learning process. So from the way that question is phrased, you're making an assumption that it will. And in fact, having spoken with this student, I know that that student actually thinks that they could be quite detracting. So it might be, how can mobile phones be used productively, or not looking at mobile phones necessarily, but you might be looking at Web 2 technology in respect to a particular learning aspect. Could be self-regulated learning, could be in managing information, managing time, possibly could be an aspect that you would look at. Second question, how might a student utilize the mobile phone in such a way as to assist their learning process, which is, I think, a more effective way of phrasing what I just was talking about before in respect to looking at an aspect such as, for example, time management, or could even be like rote learning or something like that. So you looking at one particular app, or if we're looking at tablets or something for a particular purpose, but you would need to narrow it down in respect to what aspect of learning you're looking at to make it focused enough. What knowledge and strategies might the teacher need in order to optimize the use of mobile phone? Well, that kind of leads in to, it's, I guess, a sub-question, which again relates to how can we use this in an optimal way. We could interview teachers and find out, okay, what sort of Web 2 tools do you use and why, and generate an understanding from that. And in fact, that might be quite a nice fit with the iPad questions that student 3 is asking. We've also got, what is the impact? And that clearly flags a measurement approach. What's the impact of mobile phone usage on students' engagement? Again, we would need to define what aspect of engagement and motivation in learning. When we're looking at things that are going on, if you like, between the ears of a student, so in their head, it's quite difficult for us to measure that accurately. We might do a survey in respect to opinions and how do you feel about this and how do you feel about that and what sort of thinking strategies are you using. But a lot of the time, if we're just observing students, we're looking really at behavioural engagement because we don't actually know what they're thinking. And motivation, we don't know if we're looking at extrinsic motivation or more intrinsic motivation, which is connected to values and feeling kind of responsibility for one's learning. So again, those are some considerations that you need to take in and decide which aspect would be A, feasible to investigate, and B, fits in with your purpose. And a lot of the time, it's completely up to you. You need to kind of decide, well, I'm interested in looking at this because of whatever. Again, as I've said before, do keep in mind that you're doing this mainly to really inform your own practice. So it might be that you want to try to use a particular type of application, for example, on a phone for a particular lesson purpose or learning purpose, so that you're then investigating how can I use that, and how does that seem to impact on students' engagement or use of class time productively or whatever it is. Okay, student 3, what are the best ways to integrate the use of iPads? Okay, you're assuming that there is such a thing as a best way, but we might look at you might compare 2 or 3 methods and into the classroom in respect to what. So you would need to define that again, and you would need to again clarify a particular purpose of learning and why you would use it. So you might consider, how can iPads or mobile devices be integrated in respect to, and then you would need to think of what it is you're seeking to develop in students. It might be independent learning, it might be to promote peer feedback, it might be to whatever, but you need to hang it up on something, because otherwise it's just really, really broad for you. How are these devices best utilized by teachers? Okay, you're putting kind of a value-laden aspect there. I'm not sure how much that's really going to influence and inform your own learning and your own professionalism as a teacher. So I would say that question might, you might be better off not worrying too much about that one. How effective, so we're looking at a measurement aspect there, how effective are iPads and mobile devices in aiding students' development of literacy and numeracy skills? I would narrow it to one, and I would hang it up on one particular aspect. So it might be reading programs, or it might be times tables in maths, and how can we use those apps to bridge or address that learning gaps, and how effective is it? So that suggests that you would need to compare it, because you cannot determine the effect of something unless you have something to compare it with. And in order to actually make that happen in a classroom, one way, which is pretty kind of pragmatic, to explore a comparison, is to use stations within the classroom. So you might have one station where you would have kids on mobile devices and iPads, and you'd have one station where they would do some other thing. They might be using blocks, but it would be a similar learning outcome that they would explore, and then you'd observe and you'd compare. So you'd measure something to see how much time they're spending on it, how enthusiastic they seem. So you would need to determine, how would you know that? How is it going to manifest itself? You could also do a pre-test, post-test, and see if one of those groups make more learning gains than the other. Are iPads useful in a useful teaching aid for learning? Very broad. You would need to define in respect to what and for what reason, and is it for any particular students you're thinking of? What pedagogical approaches can the use of iPads enhance, and how? Okay, probably something you would explore with teachers and go for a very emerging approach, because you don't really know what you're looking for there. But it's not a bad question, actually. How can current iPad use in schools be improved? Okay, very broad again, because it's going to vary so much, so you would need to probably decide on a particular school in order to try to see how that can be developed further. So I would make that really site specific and link it to a particular purpose. Improved in respect to what? Breakages, or in respect to independent learners, or in respect to behavior management, or whatever. Okay, student 4. How do students on the autism spectrum best connect with learning intentions? I would put that probably as a case study, and I would decide on a particular either spectrum disorder or a particular student, because it's going to be so different for different students. It's going to be very difficult to generalize those areas, but certainly it would be something that's probably going to be quite meaningful to your own practice. You might consider a particular student and think, how can I best cater for this student's need, and what does the literature say about it? How do we facilitate optimal learning opportunities and success for, and I'm guessing I've inserted that A because there wasn't one there. So I'm assuming you're looking at a student rather than lots of students on the autism spectrum. Alternatively, that you're looking at a particular, if you like, a group of students on the autism spectrum. It could also be within one specific site or one specific classroom that you might look at. So I think you've got some interesting ideas. Optimal learning opportunities, I think, is there such a thing? You're making some assumptions there, and it's quite value laden. So you might look at, again, trying to connect it with maybe one particular area that they need to develop. It might be connected to an individual development plan of the students needing to, for example, practice peer interaction, or it might be broadening their vocabulary, or trying to broaden the repertoire of interests or something like that, becoming more of a risk taker rather than staying within the comfort zone. So you would need to think of, again, something quite specific that you would explore. And you've got them as problem-solving questions, which I think makes sense. Yep. Next one. Interested in boys faring in the current educational system. Drop in numbers completing. Are boys becoming disconnected from the school environment? Really broad. Are there particular boys you're looking at? Are they increasingly disengaged? Do we need to change the way boys are engaged within the educational setting? I think it's an important topic, certainly, but I think the way you've got it at the moment, it's very, very broad. And you might look at, okay, what works? So actually looking at the Gresham reading, okay, what have they found to be helpful in engaging boys and making really meaningful learning happening. So rather than focus on all the things that might go wrong, look at, okay, what works? Okay, even if there is a problem with lots of students disengaging, okay, how can we go about it? In fact, for that particular question, you might, I happen to have been informed of a digital shed and a learning hub, if you like, in Morwell. And they're looking for people to investigate some of the things that are going on. So you might, if you contact me, I'll see if we can have a bit of a chat. I might even ring you because I know who you are and see if that might be an avenue for you to explore. Okay, the other question has to do with direct instruction. So again, you're looking at, which is good, you're looking at a specific learning approach there and the use of technology. Okay, I'm thinking that you might be one for this particular hub. And if direct instruction is improving educational outcomes, again, in respect to what? In respect to school retention, in respect to gains on tests in a particular discipline, or what? Are students less or more engaged? Again, that word, what do we mean? Which aspect of engagement are you looking at when technology is used to deliver the content? Okay. I think pretty good questions. I would definitely encourage you to decide on what do you mean by engaged. Yeah, but other than that, good. So then just taking or kind of revisiting some of the things you spoke about in regard to the Gresham reading that quite a few of you decided to have a look at, which is a qualitative reading. It's a practitioner research study generated at a single-sex school in Sydney. So some of the strengths in the literature that you've put on is that you're saying that it's discussed in detail how the boys respond to completing work. Okay, so there's some strengths in respect to the focus, I guess. One of the negatives you're putting on or highlighting there is that you're saying it's only a group of year 12, year 11 boys in an advanced English class, doesn't give a wide variety of learning types. Yeah, that's true. But on the other hand, because it's not actually seeking to look at the wider picture, it's not seeking to do an objective, if you like, or generalizable, this applies to all year 12 boys. It's looking at making some really site-specific or generating some site-specific meanings and informing that teacher's practice. So just keep that in mind as you investigate the literature. Another student has said that the literature covers readings, shows both current and seminal articles. Yeah, comes from Australia and America, which is a similar point that the student previously made a point of, which is good. Literature could be that it could be wider. Yeah, a lot of the time we can read widely, and it's actually really good to get insights from lots of different places, not just one area, geographically speaking. Sample population, there were some interesting responses there, and in particular, again, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that this is a qualitative study, so they're looking at, again, site-specific findings, and they've deliberately chosen their population A because they work with those students. So they need to kind of describe the context of it. So one student saying it was described halfway through with pretty good detail, and then going through some of the procedures and methodologies employed to actually tap into kind of prior understandings from these participants. So as another student's thinking that it is a bit inadequate because they would consider feedback from all grades in primary school more appropriate. Again, yeah, it's a fair point, but keep in mind what the researcher is actually setting out to do. They're seeking an understanding from that particular cohort. So therefore, it doesn't really make sense for them to look at all those other students or other grade levels. Sample population relatively small, yeah, unclear what the socioeconomic background in the student is, okay, and I'm guessing that you're making that point because you're arguing that that would be quite helpful in understanding what, a factor that is important in respect to these particular students, and I think that could be, it's a pretty valid point. Again, look at the research question and think, okay, do we need to know the socioeconomic background for this? And you're actually making a really good justification there. The reason for knowing the socioeconomic background of the students would be interesting is that it gives a clear picture of the ability of the students to be able to engage in technology-driven content, presumably in respect to what they've got at home for computers, etc. Apart from that, the sample population is described well. Okay, strengths and weaknesses in respect to what they did to collect the data to answer the research question. This student is saying that it was quite a wide variety of research. They used a number of different data collection methods. Yep, and that's fine. And we've already spoken about the number of participants. So I get your point, but just keep in mind that they're not seeking to do it to the general population. They're just seeking to get an understanding for that population. Strengths and weaknesses in respect to the discussion of the findings. Good support for the discussion in respect to relating the evidence, so generating that discussion from the findings. There's some quotes there to substantiate the voices of the participants, which is a good point you're making in the discussion because that supports the researcher's interpretation. Could have drawn from external sources and tied together what each of the participators were saying. And I'm guessing that there you're inferring that there's not actually many references to literature, which is a good point because it's not in the discussion. Okay, another student is saying that the discussion and findings are laid out well with the use of quotes, observations, so you're making the same point, but a lack of references to other scholars' knowledge to support the findings. Yeah, good. Limitations, we've kind of spoken about that, and you're making the point here, pretty much all the answers, that yes, they are limited, and it's true, they are limited, and when we're doing qualitative research with a small sample group, yeah, we need to say this is a limited sample. But you can say, so, these findings are not going to be applicable to the wider population. On the other hand, you would probably say if you're using a small sample group that's specific to your setting, you would say, well, my intention is not actually to do that. My intention is to get a rich and complex, nuanced understanding of what goes on here, which is why you're using the rich data. So that's the point you're making. All right, so that's my feedback on the forum responses. And I'll probably do a similar thing next week as well. Thank you so much for posting. Good work. And I'm going to get on with your lecture and record that very shortly. Thank you.